come on. Hey guys. Oh, it's a little bright today. I'm going to turn this down. I see what you're all saying too. I put this up before I'm ready to go live, specifically to give people a chance to actually come in too. So making coffee in the meantime. And by making coffee, I actually meant running downstairs to get a salted cold brew. Because I ran out of beans. I figured I'd start it, order online, run downstairs, pick it up, and we're good. We're going to turn this down slightly. I'm a little pale today, but I'm also just pasty. Pete Conrad. Pete's been very vocal today, so maybe he will actually jump in and join the conversation. And by conversation, of course, I mean like smash his face into the microphone. I'm gonna give it a couple more minutes. I'm just gonna chat. Pete, knock it off, babe. Maybe let a few more people kind of straggle in. I'm keeping an eye on the social stuff. My new mic just got here. I just haven't had a chance to set it up and stuff. So we're doing the giant mic in my face again one more day. Let's see what's happening on if anyone, the Twitters, the Facebooks. Pete Conrad, knock it off. Pete, come on. Come here. Come up here. Show the internet your little stripy tail. Come on, babe. He's just going to bite my feet now. This is what he does. The process for me of making a book. That's actually, I think that's next week's topic. Let me actually pull up the schedule that I should know off the top of my head, but do not. Weird. Let me see. Let me see what's going on. Hi, sweetie. Pete Conrad. Yeah, next week, May 7th. There he is. May 7th, I'm talking about research. So I'm going to be kind of going through the process of researching for this book and kind of how, where my research was done. Don't knock over my coffee. Where my research was done, how it all kind of came together. I'm going to be kind of walking you guys through that just because I think it's super neat. I don't know. Before I started, really being a writer, I was always interested in how people do it because it's like your thing. How did you just do that? So I'm gonna stop eating everything today. He's just eating everything today. Jeff asked about a video I did about old dishes and kind of vintage style. That's going to be on my very, very short-lived second channel. It's just under my name. If you, I think if you Google my full name, it actually comes up. It should, even though it will default to the vintage space as the most visible spot that I am online. The V-seat stored in the Lem. I'd have to look that up. Space 1, space 2. Given my interest in vintage, my into tiki things, I do love me a good tiki bar. I think it's an interesting. I'm not like super versed in the history of these things. It's Pete Conrad's, but I don't know too much about the history and kind of the social element of it. It's something that I enjoy style wise. So, okay, let me pull up. So a couple people did remark that there was no reading assignment this week. I hope you guys don't think about it as a reading assignment so much as a chance to, get some questions ready ahead of time. I was working a piece about astronaut qualifications, and honestly, I just didn't like where it was going. It was just like, it just felt meandering and a little bit like, here's a bunch of things. And it just like, I couldn't make it into a good narrative. So I just decided, forget it. I might fix it later. And I think it needs to be less about astronaut qualifications and more answering the question of whether or not I think Gerry Cobb was qualified, which is kind of what we're going to be discussing today. So I guess we're kind of doing this backwards. I have a couple other things. Scott Manley might know. Scott Manley knows a ton of things, and he probably knows more of like the minutia of where a piece of hardware is stored at launch. This is a really good coffee. Okay, last couple of things to get pulled up here. We've got a decent number of people, and it's been 5 minutes, so we're just about to start actually diving into the story here. Okay. Okay, so We're good. It is not an Irish coffee. It is a salted caramel cold brew, nitro cold brew. I have a coffee shop in my building downstairs with an app, so I can order online, and then it texts me when it's ready, and then it's on the counter, and I can just pop in and pick it up. No, did my video just fail? Oh, it did just fail. Darn. And this is my fancy new internet too, so I'm out of ideas of how to fix it. Okay, let's dive in. So, for those of you who are new here, which I think is probably not many of you, but maybe some of you, I'm Amy. Welcome to my YouTube channel. And we're here because with the state of everything. Oh, I should also say I've got, you know what, guys? Chrome has been acting up for me lately, and I don't know why. Zoperplex. Will I ever do a biography on the father of American space program, Wernher von Braun? I did write a book largely about the grandfathers, plural, of the American space program, including Wernher von Braun. It's called Breaking the Chains of Gravity, and it is out anywhere you can buy books. I'm sorry, I don't know what is going on with my internet today, or if it's actually just Chrome acting up. So, let's start. So, this little series of live streams that I'm doing is taking the place of what should be a actual book tour for my new book, Fighting for Space, which is the dual biography of Jackie Cochran and Gerry Cobb, two female pilots who were, well, Jackie was like the best pilot of the 20th century, bar none. She's like the most epic badass. I absolutely love her. Also, like on the side, ran a cosmetics industry. We talked about that last week, so that link is in the description if you are curious. Pete Conrad, stop trying to open the cabinets. Oh, Dale, thank you so much for your donation. I really appreciate that. Were there reasons women were not considered for the astronaut corps because of the various unknowns, or was it just sexism? That is what we are talking about today. So we will get you will get a very long answer just in a minute here. So Jackie, one of the best pilots of the 20th century. Gerry, 25 years younger, was in the right place at the right time to be the first woman to take the medical test that the Mercury astronauts did. They did it in 1959. She did it in 1960. She took that to mean she was qualified for spaceflight. NASA felt otherwise. It turned into this very intense she said, largely playing out in the media, of who was right and who should control a female astronaut program, although there was no female astronaut program that existed. So it's a really fun story. Next week, we will be talking about kind of how the research process went, because I want to share some of the letters and stuff I got with you guys, because I found like Jackie kept everything, and I went through her archives, and it was amazing. But for now, we are going to answer Dale's question of why women weren't seriously considered for the astronaut corps in the 1960s. Now, to do that, we have to take a step back and actually look at what made for an astronaut in 1959. So the astronaut, what qualified someone to be an astronaut evolved in the 1960s. The qualifications were more or less the same until about the 1978 class, which was the first class to include minorities as well as women, because NASA stopped only accepting pilots and started accepting mission specialists as well. So even though like the astronauts of the Apollo era were sort of one type, as it were, there were slight variations between groups. But for the question of Gerry Cobb and the question of the women in trying to fly as part of the Mercury program, or kind of coincident with the Mercury program, we need to look at that first group of astronauts, which is the famous Mercury 7. We all know and probably love, because that's the group that Gerry was kind of measuring herself against. And when everything, it's all in the book, when everything got to the congressional subcommittee hearing, 1962, it was the qualifications of astronauts as they existed in 1959. It was this question of who was right from that era versus the women. It was right around the time NASA was selecting Group 2, but we'll get to that in a second. So let's talk about what exactly made for an astronaut in the late 1950s. Well, the late 1950s were just fun because no one knew what was happening. So I should really have a copy of Breaking the Chains on my desk, considering I reference it all the time. But anyways, in my first book, Breaking the Chains of Gravity, I talk a lot about, the whole book is about kind of a prehistory of spaceflight. So looking at the roots of NASA as it existed in various parts that were then brought together under the new National Air, oh my God, Aeronautics and Space Association. I'm sorry, I'm looking at National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics and kept wanting to say it. So basically what happened was all of these civilian groups under the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics were doing all the wind tunnel testing, the early flight testing. It was the NACA was running the X-15 program. It worked with the military. So what basically happened was for any given project, the NACA did kind of the fine engineering, really made it a beautiful, workable plane. And then the military would put fighters in the jets and also bombs on the things. So the two halves really worked together, and the two of them kind of created a lot of programs that then fed into NASA. It was LBJ's again, all in here, it was LBJ's recommendation that the United States create a standalone space agency, and it was signed into law by President Eisenhower. So on Tuesday, October 1st, 1958, all of the 8,000 people that worked for the NACA were suddenly working for NASA, and now they were in the business of space. Anthony Dunn, I'm going to pause for donations today because I can see them on the side. Anthony Dunn, thank you so much for your donation. I really do appreciate it. It does mean so much to me, you guys. And it's so helpful. Thank you so much. So everyone that was working for the NACA, a lot of people were already kind of thinking about spaceflight. Some of the people included like Max Faget, who was working on blunt body spacecraft. Oh, I don't have any models with me. He was working on blunt body spacecraft, which is basically what the Mercury spacecraft was. So this kind of truncated cone idea that would fall with its blunt end through the atmosphere, and that would kind of create that bubble that would help protect it from heat, which coupled with a heat shield would protect the astronauts inside versus, landing like a plane. There were people who were already dealing with some space stuff with the NACA. So when it was NASA, it wasn't like it was totally new. And again, this is like the point of my first book. It wasn't like NASA wasn't born in a vacuum and then suddenly space. It was like, okay, you're all dealing with space a little bit. So now you get to do it. So I think I actually read this in, this is pretty obvious, but I think I first read it when I was, 13 in Pete Conrad's memoir or biography rather, written by his widow, Nancy, that, NASA existed to bring together all the elements of space flight that existed in America to show for a big showing of power against the Soviet Union. But in reality, it was just to get an American in space before the Soviets got one of their guys up. So that was really like one of the big questions. Who is going to be the first American in space? How is this going to work? And like, how do we even do it? So this became the work of the Space Task Group, which was based out of Langley, Virginia, and led by administrator at the time, T. Keith Glennon. And its job was to figure out who would be the astronauts in what was then called Project Astronaut, because we know NASA is super creative with its names and acronyms. So there was really nothing to guide who should be an astronaut at the time. There was, the closest analogs were really aviation medicine and experimental flight, because the only, no one had done this before, but it was fast. It was going to be some kind of pilotable vehicle, and like, it's similar to the air ? But like not at all. So, there was very little guidance, and they really started looking at, who is it going to be? Is it going to be like daredevils? Do we just put up, people who are super fearless? Do we go with contortionists because they're small? I mean, what do we do? Who do we put them up? So the original idea was actually to put out a public call for volunteers for the position of a research astronaut candidate as part of Project Astronaut. And this became the base criteria. Applicants had to be American citizens between the ages of 35 and 40 by the date their application was filed, be in excellent physical condition, which is super vague, stand no taller than 5 foot 11 inches, because if they were taller, the Mercury spacecraft would not close properly over their head. And they also had to be weigh less than 180 pounds. And I'm so sorry, I do not have metric conversions in front of me. And I used to know what that was. 180 pounds, because if they were heavier than that, the Redstone rocket that was going to be launching these suborbital missions would not be able to get off the ground. How good do you feel about spaceflight right now? So These candidates were also required to have a bachelor's degree in physical, mathematical, biological, medical, psychological sciences, or engineering, as well as 3 years of relevant technical or operational experience. It was just, again, this is like we don't really know what they're going to be doing. So let's take people who kind of know this world a little bit. We're all making it up. Let's bring in some of our own because we can make it up together. I mean, it really does feel sketchy. And this ad says, though astronauts would go through extensive training and the capsule would be largely automated, the astronaut would be a passenger but would have a chance to contribute by monitoring the cabin environment and by making necessary adjustments. They would have the continuous displays of position and altitude and other instrument readings, and would have the capability of observing things and operating some reaction controls. They would also be in charge of physiological, astronomical, and meteorological observations. So the ad, and because we're leading to, I'm going to lead the witness / audience a little bit, because we're leading to the question of whether women could have qualified. This call never actually said men between the ages of 35 and 40, though it does use male pronouns. So it's kind of almost this like understanding that the only people who would have the experience at the time were men, but it also never expressly says it can only be this. So amazingly, for how like narrow this is, of height, weight, age, experience, all of that, it was still deemed too broad. One of the reasons was NASA was concerned that it would be a job that would attract weirdos with a death wish, was actually how someone described it. So the idea was, we need to figure out how to narrow this pool in a way that makes sure that the people are doing it for the right reasons. They're doing it for valor. They're doing it for, to help further mankind. They're doing it to serve their country. And President Eisenhower wanted a measure of security because, again, if you have a random person off the street, I don't honestly, as I'm saying this, I don't know how extensive background checks could be in 1959. Obviously not as extensive as they are now with everything digitized, but the idea was we need somebody whose background is vetted and who has the support of an organization to say they are not a psycho with a death wish. So, it was Eisenhower who said to make things a little bit more secure, because even though NASA is civilian, this is still the Cold War, it should maybe be men taken from the existing pool of military test pilots. And that was really because NASA agreed, because an experimental test pilot was the closest thing that existed in the country that was like at all what people imagine spaceflight would be. And it makes sense if you think about it. Experimental test pilots are used to flying new designs that have never been proven, that have been proven in a lab, on paper, in a wind tunnel. But effectively, at the time, a test pilot was like a scientist running experiments, only his laboratory was the sky and he was in the experiment. He also had to be constantly communicating with the ground, not only for, positioning and speed readings and everything, but to be able to tell engineers what was happening. If you're going through the sound barrier and you feel one wing dipping, that can mean there's something off in the design of your plane. If you see something or feel something going through high-speed flight, the engineers need to know that so they can hone the future design. It happened a lot with these planes that engineers would make subtle changes between, from one plane to the next. So every flight, even if it's, the X-15 family or the all the X-planes are the experimental ones. I just like the X-15, so go to it a lot. Every plane, every flight would have a different goal, and there might be something a little bit different in each plane. And the test pilot had to adapt to that and be able to communicate to the ground and remember what was happening to give all that feedback to the engineers, because sometimes you need that pilot who understands how how planes are rigged more than just telemetry and data. The other thing test pilots were really good at this time was making snap decisions that would, in fractions of seconds, that could mean the difference between life and death. Because we're using the X-15 as an example again. In the X-15 at the time, it wasn't going super, super fast. It was kind of, nudging Mach 2, but pilots were flying Mach 2. They were planning and getting ready to go faster than that. Going that fast, a single hesitation can mean a lot of problems. You have to react instantaneously, but also react to problems instantaneously while keeping your cool. So this is a really interesting skill set that starts to develop when NASA realizes this is basically what spaceflight is. Mercury was an experimental program. It was an experimental flight program. No one knew it was going to happen to the astronaut on board, and no one knew exactly how the systems all had to work. So it was the case. Like, they knew going in that every spacecraft is going to be a little bit different from the previous one to make sure that issues were resolved, that anything new, anything that had to change was changed, any new system, new development for a future program could be tested. It was very similar to an experimental flight program, only this one's in space instead of above Edwards Air Force Base. So it's the closest analog was really this military test flying. NASA approved the idea of picking only military test pilots and kept the same base qualifications of height, age, experience, but then added that they had to have graduated from a test pilot school, have a minimum of 1,500 hours of flight time, be a qualified jet test pilot. That's an incredibly narrow group. Of nearly 178 million people that were living in the United States at the time, 110 men met those base requirements. That's it. This is not spaceflight deselecting anybody based on anything other than skill. It so happens that at the time, women couldn't fly for the military. There were still a lot of barriers for women pilots. And this actually all goes back to Jackie in the Second World War. Again, all in here with Jackie. In the Second World War, Jackie ran the WASPs, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, and she tried to get them militarized under the U.S. Army Air Force, not under the Army. And when she didn't, it became this massive issue. And ultimately, the women were never given military benefits. They were never given ex-military status. And women were not granted any kind of weren't given any kind of flight status with the Air Force. They were able to serve in the reserves, but could not fly. And they definitely were, if they were called up to fly for something, for some special assignment, it would never have been a experimental test program. So yes, this basic qualification deselected women, but it was also so specific, it deselected most of the country. We're taking a coffee break. Okay. So that's kind of where the requirements of astronauts were. And then we get into the testing. So 110 men met those base requirements. They were all sent top secret orders that had very little information about the program. And all of the paperwork made it very clear that it was totally a volunteer thing. You did not have to sign up. If you didn't want to do it, there would be no hard feelings. You could continue on with your military career. And in fact, a handful of people who got those orders didn't want to ruin their military careers. Many felt that flying with a civilian agency would damage their ability to then rise up through military ranks, be it through the Air Force or the Navy. Many thought that it was a risk of not flying, that taking a gamble on this new business of spaceflight that had no guaranteed future might not only take them out of the flight rotation and kind of stall their military careers, but it might just kind of leave them sitting behind a desk waiting to see what would happen next. So the pool ended up self-narrowing to just over 85 candidates. From there were those 85 candidates went through a round of screenings, and not all of the tests were overt. Actually, every conversation the astronaut candidates had with NASA brass was designed to actually reveal their motivations, shed light on personality, reveal their communication skills, and those less tangible qualities like dependency and adaptability. They also had much more obvious tests like psychological probing for odd personalities. NASA didn't want anyone who was too shy, anyone too strident or forceful in their personal ambitions. They wanted to make sure that whoever it was doing it for the right reasons. There were deeper background checks that ended up deselecting some men who were missing requirements. They might not have graduated from college before they joined the military or what have you. The pool narrowed and narrowed and narrowed to 32 candidates. This last group of 32 candidates went on to the final phase of testing, which was the medical stuff. And this, if you've seen the movie The Right Stuff, which I imagine everyone in here has, this is, of course, the famous scene. I always reference the guy who plays Al Shepard. I never remember the actor's name, running down the hall holding his own enema bag. I mean, that's the testing. So This testing was some of the most detailed and extensive medical testing ever devised to this point. And this really reflects just how much no one knew anything about spaceflight, because no one knew how much spaceflight would kill somebody. Really, I mean, NASA didn't know if your eyes, without gravity, if your eyes would distort and you wouldn't be able to read, you wouldn't be able to see dials, you might be completely, lost in a cockpit and just have no ability to kind of orient yourself. You might not be able to swallow, so you couldn't eat food, and therefore spaceflight would be impossible. There would be, everyone knew muscular deconditioning would be a problem, but how quickly would you lose muscle mass? Would you atrophy in a day? Would you, what kind of problems might you have? So the idea with the medical testing, like I describe it like this, and it sounds goofy, but it's pretty spot on, I think, is like they decided to send the most physically fit men they could find and hope they died the least because they knew there would be damage. The idea was, let's minimize the damage and get the best data. So there was all this medical testing that was, lung function, heart function, EEGs, EKGs, all of the things. They also did another round of psychological testing at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And this was to see kind of like, what would you do alone in the dark for 5 hours? Would you start hallucinating? Would you be able to kind of keep your head? Again, if you're in space and all of your lights go out and you're out of comms, will you be able to stay calm and actually figure out a way to get out of that solution? So many things had to be determined because no one knew what was happening. They also did a series of simulation tests. So this was one of the famous ones. It's called the Dilbert Dunker. They would put the astronauts, strap them into a capsule, shoot them in a pool at a 45-degree angle, upside down, and then have them get out without dying. Because Mercury was going to splash down, they had to make sure these guys could stay calm when submerged upside down and disoriented and get themselves out of the spacecraft, the mock spacecraft at this point, in a pool. There were divers, but make sure they could get themselves out without panicking or drowning and needing to be rescued. So when all was said and done, the testing revealed that almost everybody was great. There's two little side stories I'll tell on this because I think it's really interesting. Jim Lovell was actually deselected from after the medical testing because he had an excess of bilirubin in his liver, which is just a pigment that doesn't really do much. He obviously made it the next time around and became the most flown astronaut of the Apollo era. Pete Conrad, hang on. Pete Conrad was deselected from the medical testing as well because he was deemed psychologically unfit for spaceflight. Yeah. Turns out having a sense of humor in space is actually a very good thing because he flew some of the more interesting long-term missions. I just think it's really, really funny that, obviously these original tests, these qualifications were not perfect. They evolved over time. Those are two examples of like how it changed. So when all was said and done, after Pete and Jim were deselected for unnecessary reasons, we ended up with the 7 Mercury astronauts. That's, let's see if I can name them all on command. John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, Gus Grissom, Wally Schirra, Deke Slayton, Al Shepard, and Gus Grissom. Those 7 guys were the most had the best experience, the most relevant experience, and were the most physically fit humans in the country who would likely die the least in spaceflight. So, yeah. So now, how does Gerry Cobb stack up? That's really the question. So I don't know what you guys think. I guess I'm going to pause here for a quick second because I don't know what you guys think about like how intense that is, if that seems realistic or not. Because it's, to me, I think given the unknowns that NASA was dealing with, I think it makes total sense that it was take as many questions out of the equation as you can, because so much is going to, I said Deke Slayton. I definitely said Deke Slayton. There were so many things that no one knew what was going to happen. It was like, send up the people who are used to risk. Send up the people who know how they are going to react in a tough situation. Send up all of the people who have the best chance of not only surviving, but, I did say Gus Grissom twice. Gordon Cooper. Gordo Cooper's the other one. Send up the people who not only will likely make it back, but who will bring back the right research to help push us forward. So it's kind of this two-part thing of you need the person who is the physical specimen to survive, but who will educate you as they come back. So it's a hugely tall order. And I think when you remember that spaceflight was never not about politics. It was always about beating the Soviet Union. When you put it into that context of like it's a weird offshoot of war, it makes sense to take this very specific group of people because you need to succeed. You don't have time to go slow. You have to do this now. So how does Gerry Cobb stack up? So Gerry Cobb, this is a fun one. So Gerry Cobb, when she met Randy Lovelace, I deliberately introduced some evidence in the epilogue of this book that calls into question how she met Randy Lovelace. And I kind of it was a very deliberate decision. So if you do read it, please do read the entire book through to the epilogue. She met Randy Lovelace through whatever means, when she was 28 years old and had about 7,000 hours in the air under her belt. She also had 3 records to her name. She had 2 distance and 1 altitude record, but they were all in mid-weight class propeller planes. She'd never flown a jet, and her top speed on any of her flights was around the 300 mile per hour mark. I think it was maybe even a little bit less than that. But that's where her relevant experience stopped. Now, she had more hours in the air than a lot of the test pilots did, but her flights that she was doing, her distance flights were like Guatemala City to Oklahoma City. You know, she was doing these big, long flights to prove her longevity and her ability to kind of maintain speed in the air. She was doing less in one of those flights than an X-15 pilot was doing in, you know, a 7-minute powered flight in one of those missions. So it's a really hard thing to say, yes, she had a lot of experience, but it was a very different kind of experience. When you're flying at 300 miles an hour, less than 10,000 feet above the ground, you don't need oxygen. You can take your time to actually make a decision. You have time. She describes a flight where her compass wasn't working and she was able to actually pull a map onto her knee and, you know, map guidance like in the old days. You can't do that in a jet really easily. It's a lot harder because you're going a lot faster and you're covering a huge amount of distance. So she had some experience. She didn't have a lot, but what she did really have, she was among the most experienced female pilots in the country. Now, in the 1950s, it was really hard for women to make a career as a pilot. It was, you know, no airlines were hiring women to fly commercial planes. I mean, some were actually looking at maybe giving her a job as a commercial pilot because it was novelty. Like, it was not a thing that anyone was comfortable with. It was not a thing that people wanted to see done. It was really this like we can do this because it's different, but like there will be a man with you. I mean, that was the mentality. Gerry was still able to make a living as a pilot, but she was doing a lot of weird odd jobs. She was, you know, got hours as she could, kind of picking and choosing little places. She flew a lot of small little planes. It was not something that was easy to come by. She did end up working for a company called Fleetway, ferrying planes around the world, which was, you know, I think probably her biggest and most kind of steady job flying. And we actually talked a little bit about that. It's in the description, the episode where I discussed Gerry's romance with Jack Ford, and then also Jack Ford's wife, Mary, who she never mentions in her memoirs. Yeah, it's sketchy. It's a little steamy there, but so she was able to find work flying, and she covered a lot of ground. She got a lot of hours in the air, but she's flying. It's similar to like commuting for work. Like, if you're commuting an hour for work every day, you're a good driver, I hope. But that doesn't mean you can like start driving in, one of those intense races like the Indy 500 or something. I should know more car races for analogies, but that's kind of what it is. I mean, she's commuting to work and the jet test pilots are the NASCAR racers, the Indy 500 racers. She's not able to go from her little Nissan Sentra. I don't know why I picked that car. Sorry if you love Nissan. I don't know. She's not able to go from her, Nissan Sentra to like the crazy race edition of some Ferrari or something insane. I really don't know cars enough. So she's good. She's a good pilot. The thing is, she's also the closest analog that exists in the country to the male astronauts, because even though her experience is so much less than the men, she has more of it than most people. So she's able to take the medical tests and she does well. I mean, you can't really pass a medical test unless it's like you have something or you don't. It's not like there was a pass fail thing. She did well. She had some slight hearing loss in her left ear, and poor circulation in her legs. She had cold feet. Neither are, total things that would like disqualify you from spaceflight, although at the time it actually might have. Sorry, we're just going to pause for Daniel Balkwell. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your donation. Yes, Gerry Cobb was never a test pilot or even a jet pilot. She's never going to be an astronaut. That's where we're going. That's where we're getting. So she had some medical things that were not the best, but like generally she's doing okay. It's questionable how many times she had to actually do the medical testing to get the result that she was okay. We'll leave it there for now. It's when she got her psychological testing done that things got really weird. And this is where we're going to talk about this next week, but where her version of the story just like does not work with reality like at all. So Gerry was able to do the medical testing with Randy Lovelace through his own private pilot program because he was curious. He wanted to know how a woman would stack up against male pilots. And because NASA was testing pilots, he was doing the testing on behalf of NASA. A woman pilot was like a close analog with a close skill set, right? So he didn't actually run the psychological testing. For the men, it was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Now, Wright-Pat did not want this random woman coming in doing psychological testing. So she found her own place to do it and went to the Oklahoma City Veterans Hospital under the direction of Jay Shirley. And Jay Shirley was down to do some psychological testing. He was actually really interested in the sensory deprivation testing that the astronauts had done, because for the men, they had been in a dark room sitting at a desk for 3 hours to see how they did kind of entertain themselves and not going crazy. For Gerry, he had this thing that he developed where she floated in a giant tank of water heated to her body temperature. The air was heated to her body temperature. The room was soundproof and pitch black. And she floated, she couldn't do like the mask wouldn't fit her, so she had to actually float above the water with like a floaty under her back and under her head so she could be totally immobile. And she took off her bathing suit so she would have no sense of anything on her skin. And of course, the water, if it's, everything's your body temperature, you don't feel anything. She said she was in there for 9 hours. It is very questionable that she actually lasted that long. She did this testing. And Jay Shirley, when she came out, said, you've done well. You've actually been able to stay in this room for a decently long time. But he was a little bit thrown because he actually felt that her testing revealed a questionable psychological profile. He felt she possessed some mental qualities that could be an asset in spaceflight. She had stayed quite calm in the face of extreme boredom and isolation, but it felt off. He said it felt forced. He had the impression that she was actually hiding how she really felt, like she was putting on this brave face, like playing the role of the hotshot test pilot because that's who she thought she had to be to pass the test, instead of admitting what she actually felt. So she was very self-constrained, forcing herself to be stoic, which felt like she would be more apt to crack in a stressful environment in space. So her psychological profile is not great. Her medical testing reveals some problems. Gerry does, for whatever reason, still don't know why. No one really knows why. She went and did her simulation testing at Pensacola, at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, before the rest of the other women went. So Randy Lovelace wants to test more women. Gerry brings some in. Jackie Cochran brings some in. There's, a group of 13. One drops out. There's a group of 12. They're supposed to all go to Pensacola and do the simulation testing. This is like the Dilbert Dunker thing, under the water, trying to figure stuff out. Gerry, for whatever reason, Gerry went early and went by herself, and evidently performed so poorly it gave the Navy significant pause at the idea of testing more women. So that's the state of things. That's the state of where things were when we're getting into this congressional subcommittee hearing and stacking Gerry up against the men, Gerry and the other women. Now, Gerry had the most experience because she had done the psychological testing. Only two other women, Wally Funk and Ray Hurley, had done the psychological testing as well. It was not sanctioned by anybody. No one asked for this. They did it themselves. And only Gerry had done the simulation testing, and she had done poorly. So could they have possibly have qualified for spaceflight? Well, I mean, do you guys just want to give me your answers in the chat? What you think? There was no way that she didn't have the base requirements at all. So when Gerry testifies before this congressional subcommittee hearing, she makes the case that like women should go into space because they're lighter, they're smaller, fewer resources, easier to launch. All of that's the truth. But what she was arguing was that I have stayed alive for more hours in the air than the men because I have superior skill. Clearly, that's worth something. I have more hours, therefore, I am more qualified. When she did not. She had never flown a jet. She had ridden in a jet. She'd ridden in the back of a jet, but like, so have I. I'm not gonna like jump in and say that I have the skill set to make fast reaction times. She was arguing, and rightly, she's arguing that the women could have been trained on the simulators. And yes, that's the case. But if it's NASA's decision that they need this kind of military discipline, that's another element to consider. And I think that's an element that's often overlooked when we tell this story, is the military discipline involved. At the time of the congressional subcommittee hearing, and I hope this is helping you guys see why this was such a hard article to make short. There's a lot going on. So I talk about it all in here with the congressional subcommittee hearing that the transcript is out there. So like a lot of it's in here. Going through that, they're talking about how NASA's at the time looking for the Group 2 astronauts. Sorry, I've got the chat open, so I'm gonna start clipping some questions to get to. Yoink, there we go. She starts talking about. Sorry, my thing froze. Oh, there we go. Okay. Thank you, Dale, for another donation. I so appreciate it. Sounds like the testing standards were no nonsense back then and not PC like they probably would be today. So yeah, there's a few things to say about that. At the time, so this congressional hearing was in July of 1962. Well, in July of 1962, NASA had just decided on lunar orbit rendezvous as the mission mode for Apollo. So it had spent a lot of time looking through how best to go to the moon. I mean, what it ultimately comes down to, I think, is, okay, we have to remember it's the early 1960s. We have to remember that it's the early 1960s. This is before the second wave of feminism. Feminism meant something very different in the early 1960s than it did at the end of the decade, and definitely than it does now. To declare oneself a feminist, we're going to talk about Tereshkova in just a second. I'm grabbing that one. To declare oneself a feminist in the early 1960s was actually considered akin to declaring oneself a communist. And right, this is getting so weird that it's so complicated for a woman to politically say, I want to do something that's in the male dominant field. And then you have Gerry saying it's wrong for you not to let me do that. So the idea was, American propaganda at the time was the communist way of life is the wrong way of life because it is the Cold War. communism is what goes against the American values that we have laid out. And at the time, the American values was the woman was in the home taking care of the family post-war. The same government programs that told Rosie the Riveter to get out there and help the war effort were now saying take care of your man who's home from war. So to say that you wanted to just disrupt that order was saying that you wanted to disrupt the American way of life. And that became really, really difficult for a lot of women to have a career and have a job. And it wasn't impossible at all, but there was always going to be a challenge. So the women were up against that. They were also up against the fact that NASA had just been told it had to go to the moon. Cornelius Worthington, thank you so much for that donation. I so appreciate it. NASA had just been told it had to go to the moon. The unfortunate reality, when we look at it, what do you think is going to matter more for NASA? Figuring out how to go to the moon, or considering whether or not it's worth doing a propaganda flight with women or doing something to right gender imbalance? It just wasn't something that NASA needed to do at the time, unfortunately. And that's just the reality of it. When you couple that with the fact that the base qualifications for astronauts, because of how little was known about spaceflight, that no woman in the country, and not only that, hardly any men in the country met that base requirement. That's not to say women couldn't have done that. It's just that at the time they didn't have that experience because they were barred on so many levels going back so far. So for Gerry to say, well, we're just as qualified because we have been able to fly planes is just like, no, you're not. You're not as qualified. In fact, the only woman who had any jet flight test experience, was Jackie Cochran. And she was too old. And she was also medically unfit. I'm sorry. I don't have any mods because I don't do this often enough to have any mods. If anyone does see something, you can shoot me a message, I think. So yeah, it's not the case that a woman, let's see. Let's try. There you go. Oh, perfect. There you go, Andy Law. Nice to thank you. Tim Dodd's a good friend. So it's not the case that women saying we have experience in the air, astronauts are pilots, we are pilots, therefore we should be astronauts. It's just not the case at the time. So it's really tough. And admittedly, I totally understand that it's super weird for me as a young woman. When I started researching this book, I was the same age as Gerry when she testified that women should have an equal chance in space. It's really weird for me to come to the conclusion that no, they weren't qualified and they shouldn't have gone. So why where does Valentina Tereshkova fit into this one? So there's a couple other things here. Could any women have qualified? Could any women have qualified? And where does Valentina Tereshkova come in? These are the two kind of things that we need to discuss. So let's hit Tereshkova first because her timeline is interesting. So Valentina Tereshkova flew in June. Oh, I don't have the book next to me. In June of 1963. That was the same month that Gerry Cobb published her first memoirs in an attempt to gain more public support to force NASA into letting her fly in space. What apparently happened on the other side of the world is that the Soviet Union was reading about all the media that Gerry was drumming up for herself and thought NASA was getting ready to launch a woman because the media was actually running with this female astronaut story. So when the New York Times first reported on Gerry, it said woman passes tests given to 7 astronauts. That very quickly, those headlines very quickly became there's a female astronaut program, and there was no female astronaut program. That there's a female astronaut in training. There was no female astronaut in training. But the Soviet Union was reading this and thinking that NASA was getting ready to launch a woman. So it decided to launch a woman, which is like the ultimate weird twist. Quick pause. Quarks, thank you so much for that donation. I really appreciate it. I'm so glad that you use my stuff in a middle school. That makes me so happy. I love when teachers give me a vote of confidence that I'm doing an okay job at educating people. Thank you. So when the Soviet was looking at when the Soviet Union was looking at what to do with the female astronaut, they actually had no interest in bringing women to the program at all. It was like we don't want to do this. A lot of the cosmonauts were like, no. They were not happy about it. Granted, when some of the women came in, they were like, maybe that one's cute. Like that's kind of where they were. They didn't actually care. They didn't care about any gender balance at all. They wanted a propaganda first. So what they actually did, they looked at the reality of the Vostok spacecraft, which did not land with the cosmonaut inside. We all know this. We all know the story of Yuri Gagarin ejecting, landing, alone in a field, going to a house saying, "Can I use your phone?" And the woman saying, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Space." Whether or not that's true, I can't remember if that's actually true, but it's a good one. The Vostok spacecraft did not have a man-rated landing system. Now, the Soviet Union is quite far north. There's no available open body of water for a Soviet spacecraft to land in. Everything, where the Americans land, it's international waters, but it's easy to get to from either, ports in Hawaii, ports in California, ports in Florida. It's kind of why America actually went with splashdowns originally. The Soviet Union didn't, because there was no good place for the Soviets to have ships in the Cold War waiting for a cosmonaut to splash down. So they went with the land landing system. And this meant that the cosmonaut actually had to eject at 10,000 feet and land by personal parachute because, yeah, that's what I want to do. It just sounds awful. So what they did when they were looking for, oh, Cody Allen, welcome. I know I need to update you guys in my extra book club more. So when they were picking women, they were actually looking at women who had experienced parachuting because that was the only thing that she was going to have to do. The Vostok capsule was completely autonomous. They couldn't actually do anything manually. They had half of a code to actually do anything manually, and the other half was in a sealed envelope to open in an emergency. They didn't even have the code to override the computer. So when they were looking at women, it was about her ability to parachute and also about her ability to be a good role model for the Soviet system. So Valentina Tereshkova was a woman who had worked. Her father was killed. I forget which war, but in a war. I think it wasn't a Soviet Revolution, but he had died serving his country, and she had worked since she was a young girl to help support the family. She was a textile worker. She was educated. Her one kind of fun thing that she learned to do was parachute jumping. She was also quite good looking. She was handsome enough to put on a stamp. She was handsome enough to put on in a statue. So she was kind of the right pedigree. And actually, Yuri Gagarin was chosen for the same reasons. He was the right kind of person to be the model for the Soviet Union. And when Tereshkova was launched, she was launched to be that, here you go, United States, we did something you can't. She was really that propaganda flight that the Soviet Union was worried that Gerry Cobb was going to be for the United States, which is so weird. And it's, whenever I always feel really bad, I've gotten a decent number of emails from middle school girls and even grade school girls asking, can I interview you about Tereshkova and what she did to kind of break barriers for women? And it's really like, it's hard to explain, like, oh, she was kind of a political pawn in a lot of ways. And, people argue that no, the Soviet Union did try to open space for women. It did try to, well, it was 19 years before they launched another woman. So no, it was not about equality between the sexes. It was about one-upping the United States yet again. So that's where Tereshkova fits in. And I think I absolutely love the lineup between Tereshkova's flight and Gerry's memoir of Gerry desperately wanted to be Tereshkova, basically. And it didn't work for her at all. I just realized that was probably really loud in that microphone. And there was one other thing. Oh, what was the other? I said there were two things we had to talk about. One was Tereshkova and one was, the emerging astronaut or the evolving astronaut qualifications. So then we have this interesting, we're going to talk about research astronauts in more detail later because I actually need to do some research on this still, and it's a little bit tough right now. Yeah, so let's look at how the astronaut qualifications evolved a little bit. So we've just gone over what the astronaut qualifications were for the Mercury astronauts. It was the exact same for Group 2, except now NASA relaxed the requirement that they had to be a military pilot. They were now taking civilians, but everything else, the jet test experience, the graduation from a flight school, all of it meant they had to be ex-military because that was the only way. Bye, Dayu. Thanks for stopping by. That was the only way you could get the relevant experience was if you were flying with the military. And there were 2 men who met that qualification, all of the base requirements, as well as, they weren't military, but they were still accepted. I believe it was Elliot C. I think I'm getting that one right, and Neil Armstrong. So both were Navy pilots. Both were, Neil Armstrong was working for the NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and, switched over to working for NASA when NASA was created. So he was a NASA high-speed jet test pilot. This is like, we're talking civilian pilots, but like these are still the most highly trained, specifically talented civilian pilots. So that's Group 2. Group 3 keeps about the same. Basically, NASA figured, these guys are working for us with Mercury, with Gemini, going to the moon with Apollo. Like, we need more of the same. We know how these guys work. They have military discipline. They're doing a good job. They do what we say. They're the right guys. So gradually, filling out the ranks a little bit more. There was a group, I believe it was Group 4. I'm going to double check this right now, but Group 4, my internet is being really choppy today, but it was in the mid-1960s. It was actually right after. So this congressional subcommittee hearing was in July of 1962. In 1964, NASA started looking at a group of research scientist astronauts. The idea being, if we're sending people to the moon, we should maybe get some good science out of it, right? Sounds like a really good idea. So send a geologist, because a trained geologist, can look at a field and tell you exactly what's special, what's not, where you need to go, what you need to know, what you need to do in an instant. You can teach me a lot about geology, but like, I'm still going to have to look at a cheat sheet. I'm not going to know it. The idea was get some scientists up there to get some good science data. Let the pilot the spacecraft. This group, was it Group 4? Yes, Group 4, the scientists. This group was actually, they were purely chosen on their scientific abilities. They were not pilots going in. The idea was get the scientists, train them as pilots. You can do it backwards. When NASA started going into this group, there were actually 4 women on the shortlist, because there were some really talented female scientists working in the country. NASA had this list, and it sent it to the NSF, the National Science Foundation in America, and said, from here, let's look at, who's good, who's the most qualified, who should we send, who should we not send. And the list came back with the final recommendation from the NSF, and the women weren't on the list. And it wasn't just that the women were the only ones off the list. A bunch of the men were off too. So for whatever reason, and there might be, and here's where I'm trying to fill the gaps. It might be the case that, like, literally speaking, it's tough to figure out how you deal with, human waste management systems when you're dealing with male and female astronauts in a very small space. There might have been some question, like the Navy still doesn't allow women to serve on submarines for their own safety. It's, whether or not that was a consideration, I'm not totally sure, but for whatever reason, the women were not on the final list. But it's interesting that clearly there were women in the country who had something to offer NASA at the time. It just wasn't as astronauts as they stood in 1962. Was Jack Schmitt a pilot? I just saw that question. He might have been a pilot beforehand, but they were all doctors and research scientists, and not exclusively. I always forget that his real name is Harrison. Was he a pilot beforehand? He was a PhD geologist. Huh, maybe. I don't know. I don't think he was actually a pilot. I'll have to look into that. But he was the LMP, so he wasn't. He was there for the. He was definitely there for the science. And again, the only scientist to be on the moon. So it's interesting that clearly there were women who were qualified, and it was just not the right time for a myriad of reasons. But of all the women who were qualified to fly in space for whatever reason, Gerry Cobb was low on the list. There's a lot of, and I mean, honestly, so in writing this book, and this got wet. Coffee sweat from the mug, not from me. When I went through and writing this book and kind of going through all the letters that Gerry was writing to people, all the way she was speaking in public, because I have transcripts, you can see her attitude changing. Like she was doing all of this for the sake of women in space, and then it became me in space. I honestly think, like, even if she had been the right, thank you, Sergio. Jack Schmidt was not a pilot before he joined the program. I really think that if Gerry had convinced NASA to launch her as the same kind of propaganda ploy, just for a show of gender equality, basically doing the same as the Soviet Union did with Tereshkova, if she had convinced them, she might not have gotten the flight herself, because she rubbed so many people the wrong way. Like, people were just sick of her by that point. Like, it had been 2 years of just her showing up in their offices, like demanding they do something for her. So it was, oh, female women can serve on Navy subs. I didn't think they could yet. Huh, okay. I learned something. I don't know where I learned that anyways. So it's possible that Gerry just didn't have the right psychological profile. I mean, Jay Shirley found that she had some weird psychological tendencies. It's possible that even if they'd wanted to launch a woman, she wouldn't have been the one, because she just didn't have, to make a bad, not even a bad pun, but she didn't have the right stuff. She wasn't the right woman for the job. So, yeah. There's the very long answer of whether or not women would have been qualified to fly as astronauts in the 1960s, and kind of a brief look at what kind of where astronaut qualifications were with relation to women. So John asked if I think she should have been launched for political reasons. No, I don't. I think this is a bit of a tough one. This is a bit of a tough one, because I can't help but look at it from a modern standpoint, a little bit. I think for NASA never did things for political. I mean, okay, no, I can't say that. Space was all political, but NASA didn't make any decisions strictly based on politics. Like, it wasn't we're launching this person because it's a good show. It was, we're doing this because it's all a good show, but here's the sequential steps in engineering that we need to go through this. So, like, okay, I mean, let's look at the example, Al Shepard's suborbital flight on Freedom 7. It was a good flight, everything worked fine. He had to pee himself, but whatever. Oh, sorry. If anyone's asking about the quote unquote Mercury 13, in the description, I should have a link to the first book tour live stream I did, which is all about the story of the Mercury 13. That'll answer the questions. Oh, I totally lost my train of thought. Darn. And it was fixing to be a good one. Oh yeah. Should they have launched her for political reasons? Virtual dinner party. Welcome. So if we look at Al Shepard's flight, it was great. They did it again with Gus Grissom's flight. It was great. Didn't end as well. But the idea was actually to have every one of the Mercury astronauts do a suborbital flight and then start going into orbital missions. But they ended up pushing the timeline up a little bit, because the Soviets were starting to really, not only did they get the first human in space, but the first human to orbit the planet, and then started following up with longer duration flights. And NASA's like, we got 15 minutes in space. This isn't good. We need to save face. the decision was less political than I think technological to kind of show where things were going. And especially once you start getting into development of the Gemini program, it was never about we need to do these things to show them up. Ed White's spacewalk was a little bit like that, but it was more like, okay, now that we have the moon as our long-term goal, we're not doing things to for the sake of one-upsmanship. We're not doing these things for immediate propaganda payoff. We're doing this for the long run. We're doing this for Apollo. So, the Soviets were scoring first after first human and first living being, first satellite, Sputnik, first living being, Laika, even though she died on the way up, first human, Gagarin in orbit, first dual missions, even though they could not, make the spacecraft come close to each other like Gemini 6 and 7 did, or 6A rather. They just launched and passed each other. For Spacewalk with Alexei Leonov, that's a great story. And NASA was kind of behind at this point, but building more technology that was actually more usable. So, the Soviets were launching. I mean, if you start getting into it, it gets a little bit sketchy. The Vostok had one cosmonaut. The Voskhod was a larger version of Vostok that I think it could seat 3. I haven't gone over these details in a while. But it could seat 3 people, but not in spacesuits. So there could only be 2. I think that was the case with the early Soyuz as well. It wasn't truly as maneuverable. It wasn't nearly as functional and livable as what NASA was developing, because NASA was looking at long term getting to the moon, and the Soviets were looking at how can we get the next first. So it was 2 very different approaches to spaceflight, 2 very different almost philosophies of approaching spaceflight. So I think launching Gerry for the sake of a PR win for the United States, it may have been, a short-term win for America, but it would have been, I think it actually might have been more damaging down the line, because not only would it have been this one-off that kind of would have been a little here's a little thing while we're making all of this progress, but if NASA wasn't ready at the time to start having a mixed gendered crew or crews all around and just start having it, she would have been this weird thing of oh, we did this once and then 20 years later did it again, because Sally Ride launched 20 years after Tereshkova. So yeah, it was this weird thing of, she might have been a short-term win, but a long-term, why did that happen? Which would have been more obviously just a political flight. So I ultimately don't think it would have been great. I don't think it would have been necessary. Someone just asked, sorry, I missed your name. Why didn't women fly on Skylab? Women didn't join the astronaut corps until 1978. So in 1978, it was about 75, but leading up to the class that was selected in 1978, NASA opened the astronaut corps to pilots and mission specialists. And mission specialists could be scientists, could be anybody who didn't have to be a pilot, which opened it to a lot of women who didn't meet the requirements for pilot astronauts. So Skylab flying in the early 70s meant that women joining in the mid and late 70s did not have a chance to fly. That's my rant. I'm going to scroll through and see if there's any questions that I can see. If you guys have anything, now's a really good time, because now I'm actually looking at the chat to throw those in so I can see them. It's just we're gonna scrolling through. This is my scrolling song. It's not even a song. I wish Pete was here to entertain you guys while I shift stuff around. I mean, questions ideally about astronaut qualifications and women in the early space age or just early space stuff. In 19, sorry, X Danak, I'm gonna mispronounce that. Screen name's fun. In 1965, NASA published a blurb in a newspaper clearing up that Gemini was to be pronounced like Jiminy, as in Jiminy Cricket. Exactly. I actually have a video about this where I actually love this video. I did a supercut of all of the NASA press footage saying in Gemini 6 and Gemini 10, and it's just like it's that voice, and I just like made them all together, so it's Gemini, 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 Gemini. Yeah, it's Gemini. So it's they actually want to differentiate it from the constellation. So the constellation is Gemini, and the spaceflight program, which is forever cemented on me because it's my absolute favorite, is Gemini. How many years was Skylab in operation? Skylab flew between 1970. Was it launched in 72 or 73? I have to look. I think it was 70. It was launched in 73, and the last mission left, I think, in early 75. And it crashed in like 1979. It was up there for a while. There were some attempts to try to salvage it. None of them worked. It crashed in Australia. Let me just double check these dates here. Yeah, it was launched in May 1973, and it was there's something, one of the solar panels I think didn't deploy properly, and it was losing power. And it was actually Pete Conrad. I love that I have this. I don't know if you guys can see. He might be too washed out, but he actually has the gap in his teeth and everything. It's amazing. I love this. And he has a little helmet, so he can be like moon astronaut. Oh, Daniel, I made you a mod because you're always in here and you're very helpful. So welcome. So Pete Conrad actually said there is no way you can do this without actually having us just go up and manually do it. Like, you need somebody up there. If this happened to your car, you wouldn't just like wait. You would go and fix it. So if he convinced them to launch very quickly thereafter, and the first Skylab was like the rescue mission. And it crashed. Yeah, the last crew left in 74. It only had 3 crews. The last one was, I think, 84 days. So it was really looking at long-term spaceflight, and starting to see how humans would handle long-term spaceflight. And yeah, it re-entered the atmosphere on July 11th. I forgot the date, 79, over Western Australia. And actually, it made the Miss Universe pageant, I believe, was in Perth that year, and there was a giant hunk of Skylab at the Miss Universe pageant because it was there. And it was, this thing that was becoming, getting Australia some fun fame. That's what, yes, it was before I was born. I was not born in the 70s. Okay, Chris asked, do I think there could have been concern over public backlash in the 60s and 70s if NASA had sent a woman into close quarters with one or more men for a mission? Yeah, I think there's a few considerations when we're talking about early 1960s and women. I mean, one thing, and this is actually what Jackie Cochran points out. She talks about this in the subcommittee hearing, and talks about it in letters as well. She makes the statement that I think is very right. If in 1962 John Glenn had died, it would have been a tragedy. And both JFK, President Kennedy, and Vice President Lyndon Johnson had statements to make to the press and to the public. But it would have been, space is hard. We're doing this for America. We will press on. We will not let him have died in vain. If a woman had been in that spacecraft, it probably would have been, well, that's why we don't want to launch women into space. It probably would have been turned that way. So there's that kind of potential media backlash. If something had gone wrong, it could have been blamed on the woman. Jackie knew that was likely to happen, and that's why she was like, let's not fast track this. Let's do this the right way. She wanted to have like a large scale research program on how women, kind of gathering all the data on women, such that when NASA was ready to launch a woman, she could just hand over a report and be like, there's all your data. You have no excuse not to launch one tomorrow. As for kind of women being in close quarters with men, I think that might have been an issue in the early, maybe more in the early 60s than in the 70s. Just because, again, the idea of family values in the early 60s, the second wave of feminism really kind of started in the mid to late 60s, which started to shift the idea that, a woman could be in close quarters for, a professional reason with men. In the early 60s, yeah, it was considered inappropriate, and it might have been a problem to have a mixed gender crew in an early program. Absolutely. I think that's a great call. Good job. Good one, Chris. um, you've seen the largest chunk of Skylab. In Huntsville. I've never been to space camp. I really want to go to space camp. Space camp invited me to come a while ago, and I haven't been able to because, well, I've gotten busy, and now this. Now the world is kind of on a little bit of a standstill. So one of these days I will get to Huntsville. I am dying to go to space camp, even just to see it, just to go look around. I don't need to go to space camp. Okay, sorry, I'm looking through chat for other questions. Jeffrey points out Skylab was tainted from the start, but lasted in orbit 6 years. Yeah, Skylab has an interesting history. I don't know too much about Skylab. I forget. I think David Hitt wrote it. I'm sure he's a familiar name to some of you guys. It's called Homesteading Space. He's an absolutely lovely guy, and he's speaking of Huntsville. I think he's based in Huntsville. I think he wrote Homesteading Space. It's on my other bookshelf, or I'd look it up. But it's all about Skylab. I have it. I've sifted through it. I haven't read the whole thing cover to cover just because I haven't had it. There's so many books to read. Yes, yeah, Homesteading Space by David Hitt. I'd recommend it. If you do want to learn more about Skylab, he's awesome. He's brilliant, and he's great. And he will know a lot more than I do about Skylab. But Skylab was really like post Apollo. The idea was the Apollo. Oh no, my video again. Okay, there we go. The Apollo Applications Program was designed to kind of stretch NASA's abilities from going to the moon with this very specific architecture that was only built to go to the moon, and figure out ways to make it work for other things. And this is ultimately like the problem with Apollo is it was custom built for this one thing. And once that one thing was done, like, what now? And there were very cool mission programs or proposals floating around out there, including taking that architecture and sending it to Venus and Mars with humans on board. And I wish we'd done that. But one of the early proposals was to use it to make a space station. So Skylab was basically, it was a dry S4B stage that they retrofitted to be a space station and then launched it. There was actually another proposal that was a dry lab. There's a proposal for a wet lab that they would launch it with a live S4B stage and then like refit it afterwards. I'm not totally sure how that one would have worked, but yeah, so Skylab is just a repurposed S4B, which is super weird and super neat. Sam brought up Krista McAuliffe. It irks me when she's blown off by some people as the Challenger crew plus McAuliffe. She trained for the flight and took the same. I completely agree. I mean, I'm sure she's familiar to everybody. She's the teacher in space who, of course, died on the Challenger launch in 1986. I feel like when she's kind of separated from the crew, it's not. I don't necessarily read it as being a negative. Like, we have astronauts and then this teacher, because yeah, you train for spaceflight, you train for spaceflight. You're not like, no one's coasting through that. I think it's more, I feel like, or at least maybe that's just my read of it, is when people kind of separate her, it's more to say like that, to draw attention to the fact that that was the time that, a mother and a teacher died in front of the entire country live. Because yeah, that's such a I have a false memory of Challenger disaster. It's really weird. It's a very clear memory. It's not real. It's a room in my parents' house that didn't exist in 1986. It's very strange, but yeah, no, I think for the most part, people kind of separate that out just to kind of draw attention to her. John asked, is it true that Valentina Tereshkova was deemed so hopeless that the Soviets didn't use women again? I don't know. I don't think so. That's not something about her that I know. But granted, I'll admit I haven't looked too much into what happened to the female cosmonauts after the flights. I kind of for the most part, when I look at the women, it kind of stops with Tereshkova because that's, for the sake of writing a book, that's what I need to know more about. I don't think they were like disappointed with her so much as like, well, we did the thing, now we continue on. Yeah, I'm if that's kind of the case that she didn't really do anything. I mean, they couldn't do anything in Vostok. They just kind of sat there. I know there were a couple of female cosmonauts they were really pleased with because they married cosmonauts. I think Tereshkova also married a cosmonaut, and they were very interested in her daughter because she was the first person born to two people who'd been in space, and she did not have a tail. That's good. Let's see. Oh, Sam added, sorry, we're back on Kristen McAuliffe. I consider her as much as an astronaut as Dick Scobie or Ellison Onizuka. She had science tasks to perform in addition to the teaching gig. Yeah, no, the mission specialists don't not do stuff, right? Like they're there to do something very specific. They might not be physically piloting at this point we're in shuttle era. They're not like physically piloting the shuttle to a landing. I don't know how much they were trained to in an emergency, but they're still like, no one's going up as ballast. Like it's too expensive and risky to do that. Like everyone who went up had a reason to go. So yeah, it's just to kind of write her off as like, oh, she was just teaching in space. Like, no, she was definitely doing stuff in addition to teaching in space. Okay. Okay, we are. Oh, sorry, my chat is going nutty. We are still. Okay, we're looking through some final questions here. Oh yeah, sorry. I just saw a couple people talking about The Right Stuff, the book. If you haven't read it, like it's a great movie. Better book. I think almost like across the board, but I'm also a writer. The books are always better than the movies, but that book is so good. Tom Wolfe is such a great writer. He is such a great writer. Let's see. Sorry, guys. I'm not good at talking and also going through reading stuff. I'm amazed at, streamers who can do it. I can't do it. I don't know. Adam just asked about the Right Stuff's portrayal of Betty Grissom's frustration with how NASA treated Gus after the accident. She wrote a book about him. He wrote a book. I can't totally remember how frustrated she was, but I get the sense that a lot of that was maybe kind of enhanced for the sake of a good movie. But like for sure, I know she was frustrated by it, but I don't know to the extent in that scene where she's slamming fridge doors around. Oh, so weird. Sorry, we're back on Skylab. Robin brought up Hearst Corp offered a prize to bring a piece of Skylab to the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper. Got to see it in SF. A piece of plywood used cushioning blew my mind that they made it out of plywood. Yeah, when I found the picture, the picture of it, I'll maybe put this old video. It's an old video up in the description when we're done here. Yeah, it was made of. There was plywood as like I can't remember what exactly it was. I think it was like insulation around an oxygen tank. And it's wood. And when I first posted, people were like, there's no way. I'm like, no way. It was so weird that they actually used some plywood. We7 is a great book. Sorry, we're back on we're all over the place on questions now. We7 is a great book. So in 1960, maybe it was actually 59, the Mercury Astronauts signed an exclusive deal to write their stories for Life magazine under their own bylines. Sorry, I'll do it this way. Under their own bylines. So they had like a journalist that came around and kind of wrote their stories for them. But it came up as though they wrote it. And this book is actually the compilation of all of those articles, which is really great. Because they're definitely like, done for a specific purpose, but it's a really interesting look into kind of how their story was being told at the time, which I think I always love those. I love finding old space books from the early 60s, from right around the late 50s, because the way they're writing about it, the way they're promoting things is like the subtleties in it is so interesting. We're hoping Fighting for Space will be a very good movie, Daniel. Okay. Inflatable spacecraft in the '60s, yes. I've written about it. I will find that article and I'll put it up. I can't remember the company that was doing it. I know Bigelow Aerospace is doing it now, but NASA was looking at it. Oh, I can't remember the specifics of it, but I remember reading about that, and because I was just like, "This is so weird," and, like, 2 years later, the Bigelow thing came out, and I was like, "Guys, everything old is new again." It was one of those moments. Yeah, it was definitely, like, that was a real thing. I'm gonna find that. I gotta find that inflatable spacecraft. Let's find this. Inflatable spacecraft title. Like, that I can just Google my own name and hopefully find my own stuff, because I never remember what I call my own files. Try humming while I check the chat, but then I have to remember a song to hum. Um, let's see. Let's see. I'm sorry, I am going to miss. Oh, here's one that I saw. Sorry, and I'm sorry, I'm definitely missing some of your questions. I'm so sorry. I'm not skipping anybody on purpose. I'm just trying to get through a good amount of stuff before my voice totally gives out from talking. Donovan asked, which qualifications do I think were the most unique in order to be an astronaut cosmonaut at the time? I think the medical requirement, like, just in total, is pretty interesting. I mean, everything else makes sense to me, but looking at, bilirubin content in your liver, which has almost no bearing on your life, like, the fact that they were looking at things that detailed, I think is very interesting. It had no bearing on spaceflight really, but it had a lot of bearing in how people understood spaceflight, and I think that's interesting. So it becomes this question of, how many ways can we show that we don't know what we're doing? And the answer is everything in 1959. How different do I think the space program would have been if Nixon had not gutted the Apollo program? Well, this is a tough one. This is a big one. I'm gonna do it. I have a couple of, like, big thought piece videos I'm working on passively right now. They're coming in June once the virtual book tour is either done or less frequent. I might do bi-weekly or something. But what I want to do is actually look a little bit more at what Apollo applications program plans were kind of on the docket and what other programs Nixon was presented with. I mean, it was really between, Apollo applications kind of continuing deep space missions or a shuttle and station, and he picked shuttle and station minus station. I just think there's a problem of goals. It's hard to pick goals when you don't really know what's happening next, and yeah, I don't know enough about it off the top of my head really to answer that one, but it is a really good one and something that has been on my list. Actually, if any of you know of John Logsdon, I can't pronounce words today. John Logsdon. There it is. He's a completely lovely, wonderful man. He's been doing space policy as long as there has been space to write policy about, which is wild that I'm in the LBJ archives and just letters from this guy that I know. John's a wonderful and prolific writer. I think he teaches at George Washington University, and he has a book out called After Apollo ? And it's all about kind of Nixon and the sort of shift from Apollo to the Nixon era. And I haven't had a chance to read it yet. I should maybe pick that one up soon, because John's absolutely brilliant and lovely, and he knows all because he was there and he watched it happen. Yeah. He did one of those, like, here's 10 people. Which one of these 10 people have I not met? And the people on his list are like Babe Ruth, John Glenn, Walter Cronkite. It's like, of course you've met all of them. Okay. Do I think I would make the cut for spaceflight tests? I am too short and I am medically unfit. I know that. So no, I definitely do not qualify to be an astronaut. I don't have a math or engineering background. I don't have a science degree. My degrees are in history and humanities, and science and technology studies has the word science in it, but it's still actually an arts degree. Yeah. I'm too short, unless all of a sudden they're taking people who are just a hair under the 5-foot mark. And I have medical issues from a car accident, which would prohibit anyone from sending me into space. Do I think Do I think distracting NASA and American industry in general with gender diversity issues makes it easier or more difficult for the Chinese to take over the space domain from the United States? Um, Interesting question. Hmm. I think that's a Okay, do I think I don't think it's so much a question of distracting NASA and American industry with gender and diversity issues is really kind of what's okay, so we're putting this out there and we're assuming that I guess we're assuming for this question that China is overtaking the United States in terms of space prowess, we'll call it. I don't think it's so much the preoccupation with issues such as gender and diversity in the space program or within the agency, so much as the fact that we have a political system that shifts every 4 to 8 years, and an incoming leader will cancel their predecessor's work for any number of reasons, and that sometimes makes it really hard to lay the foundation for something. I think this is actually something I've been kind of playing with in my mind for a long time, and I should really just sit down and write it. Because we do have this turnover rate, whereas in a country like China, you don't have the same kind of rotating leadership that can affect the space program. So you can say this is the goal, and the goal can stand for 20 years. It's amazing to me in a lot of ways that the shuttle program lasted as long as it did, and the ISS lasted as long as it did, because they lasted through administrations changing parties, which is becomes kind of the problem. We know part of the reason Nixon didn't want to continue on with Apollo was because he didn't like Kennedy. I mean, that's an interesting element to consider when we're discussing the progress of spaceflight. So that is a good question. I don't have enough off the top of my head to really, give you guys a full answer on it, but there's definitely something to say for the way our system is kind of laid out versus China's, and kind of how that maybe allows us to get distracted by things, but it's more that it's harder to lay a long-term foundation in space when there's so many changes at the upper levels. Didn't know about the post-Apollo options, Mike says, and would like to know more about them. I've actually been wanting to redo the video on the Mars and Venus flybys. It's this series of proposals I found years ago. I've written about them, and the videos are just old, and I think I could do a better job at them now. So I might actually do that coming up. Just revisit that one because I like those ones. Those are some of my favorite mission proposals. Polly, thank you so much for your donation from Finland. Hello. I've always wanted to go to Finland. And I'm glad I answered your question. And I see another one up here. Grady. Thank you so much for your donation. I really, really do appreciate it, you guys. And thank you so much for your kind words as well. That really means a lot. Thank you. I look taller on screen. Also true. Thanks, guys. Okay. I am scrolling. The US would have gone to the manned bases on distant planets. Explorer Maps is after Apollo ? I don't know if you're referencing the book or if that's actually a question, so reading it. According to the estimates timeline in my book, the US were going to have manned bases on distant planets by 1985. I mean, that was kind of the idea with Apollo applications. The idea was to continue with the technology, and like the lunar module could only go to the moon, but the workhorse of the Saturn V was actually well suited to a lot of things, and Skylab proved that you could make a station out of the S4B, and that you could live for a long time in space. So the idea was, with a lot of these programs, what if we put like a living module in place of the lunar module, and that became kind of a long distance space flight or spacecraft. That was the idea, and it's super interesting. There's a minimum height for spaceflight, because if I'm strapped in a chair, right, and I can't reach the buttons, I am very useless. They're not going to give me a garden gopher to hit a lever. So yeah, if you have to be a certain height. We had this problem. This was just more of a PR mess than anything, but like the whole all-female spacewalk, and then they didn't have suits small enough for the women. Like, suits come in medium, large, and extra large, I believe. Like, I would be an extra small, probably. Like, just don't make stuff for people because nothing is custom made anymore. It's all off the shelf. So if I can't fit into the off the shelf spacesuit and I also can't reach the buttons, like no, it'll be like that episode of The Simpsons when Homer goes into space with Buzz Aldrin and the other guy. And Homer's whining about being thirsty, so Buzz radios down permission to sedate cargo. Like, I would be the cargo. I would not bring chips into space. I would also try not to damage the ant farm. Now, we will never know if ants can be trained to sort tiny screws in space, which could have very significant impacts on watch manufacturing and watch repair. Yeah, I watch a lot of Simpsons. Okay, does that mean if you had the option to be a space tourist, would I be unable to do it? Without going into my medical history, we can do like medical story time another day. It's not like I haven't put pictures of myself in a hospital with tubes down my nose on the internet before. I don't know that I would be medically cleared for any kind of space flight, even if it was tourism. I would probably be okay on a suborbital flight. The issue is if I get sick, I kind of need to go to hospital like now, not in 4 orbits. So it might be a problem for me. I honestly, like, I probably wouldn't go because I don't even love camping when I'm really far from a city with a hospital for the same reason. So yeah, that's fun. Chris said gender equality shouldn't be seen as a distraction. It should be seen as a worthy and realistically attainable goal. 100% agree. But there's a swath of people out there who will see it as a distraction and use it as a distraction for certain constituents. So I think that's a reality of it a little bit. I will say this again and again. I hate that we have to have the conversation about gender in space or gender in anything because we are all humans. Humans can do things, therefore we can all do things. We all have unique skills. We all have talents. We all have something to offer, be it a mission, be it, whatever. I so look forward to the day when it's, I do not want to see if there's a mixed crew going to the moon and it's led by a woman and she's going to be the first one. I don't want you to tell me that. I want you to say, like, here's the astronauts, Chris, Katie, and Jim, random names. Katie will be first out, Jim will follow, Chris will stay in orbit. It's not about like the first woman, it's just about 3 humans. Cause I think that's ultimately the way to change the conversation so that it's just like, we can just be humans together, is to just like stop making women as other, stop making minorities as other, cause we're all just people. But I know that's hard. I know that's not something that's going to happen instantly by any stretch. It's a tough one. Minimum height for an astronaut. I think last time I looked, and this is a long time ago, I think it was 5'2" or 5'4". I think it was that. So yeah. Smaller people are later to send up and cheaper. True. I mean, I'm very efficient. I'm very cost effective for spaceflight. We are scrolling through a tiny bit on accessibility. Yeah, I think there's going to be a shift. I think this might actually come from more commercial and space tourism stuff when we start seeing accessibility in space, which can mean almost anything. Because it is going to have to be open to more people. I mean, it's one thing to say you need a certain kind of person who's, the right physical specimen in terms of abilities, as well as height, as well as strength, to do something like, go to Mars and break rocks or something, but once we're getting into space tourism and we start seeing that it's more common, it's going to have to change. Now, whether I suspect, and I don't work for any of these companies, I just feel like it will probably come from an Elon Musk or a Jeff Bezos, because it's a profitable business then, versus a government who's doing it with taxpayer money for the sake of science. I think they have very different goals and very different reasons to doing things. And I want to grab this one because I see it fading and my chat is not scrolling, but I saw another donation coming in. Oh, Philip, thank you so much. I really do appreciate your donation. Thank you. Off topic, do I have any thoughts on the newly announced Artemis contract? Do I have a favorite proposal? No. I don't have. I haven't gone into it in super deep I haven't done like a deep dive into what they are. I mean, basically looking at the concept art, they all look weird to me because I like my little spidery lunar lander. No, I haven't gone into a deep dive on it at all, so I don't have a favorite proposal yet. There's my unexciting answer. Okay, gonna look and see if we have a couple of. Andy says space elevator not happening anytime soon. To be clear, probably true. Just wear heels. Yeah, it's like again, I'm good. Do you know the Simpsons reference with Bart at Duff Garden sticking the lollipops under his shoes so we can go on the roller coaster, and then he falls out? Yeah, that'll happen. Okay. Let's see. Trying to see if there's anything else coming in. I think we are max height requirement. It's 5'11". Yeah, same thing. If you are too tall, you have the same problems that off the shelf seats aren't going to fit you. You're going to be like cramped in everywhere. It's going to be a bit of a mess. So yeah, a lot of these things are like the most physically fit and then also the most like standard size. It's weird. I mean, spaceflight is weird. When you think about it, like everything in space is difficult and trying to kill you. So you have to pick the people who fit and will die the least. It's so bad, but it's true. Do I collect old space books? I do. Yeah, I should do a space book tour. I did one once, I think, but yeah, I haven't been. I mean, honestly, I've been collecting more Jackie ephemera as of late. But I'm so sorry, guys. I will remember to get a conversion calculator on my thing next time. But I have collected space books. I'm collecting a lot of like vintage pictures and stuff. I'll show you guys. Like, I knocked Pete over. Model Pete, not Cat Pete. Pete Cat is sleeping. He's sleeping. The stuff I'm collecting lately. So here's Jackie with her Bendix 1937. This is in 1937. She flew this plane. I don't know if this is her plane or an earlier model of the Seversky she flew in 1938, but it came with a telegram sent about her flight. And then this is a signed cover she carried in the 1946 Bendix. So that's her right there. I'm going to scan all these things and put them up. So this is the stuff I'm collecting lately. But Sparky, thank you so much for the donation. I so appreciate it. Big rocks, little rocks on Mars, prisons on Mars. Oh, because I mentioned breaking rocks on Mars. I mean, at some point we're going to want to crack a rock open and see if there's anything in it, like a fossil, right? I'm just thinking of like, what would you need someone who's like big and strong and can move is like cracking a rock. I don't know why. There's nothing on Mars but rocks. That's I don't know. Someone out there can make a better Star Trek joke than me because I'm not a Star Trek person. Okay. I think we're gonna call it because I think I've answered a decent number of your questions. Again, guys, okay, if you have more, this will be go to Mars, start bashing things the human way. Unfortunately, yes, I do have this like real problem with the way we're probably going to explore things, which is like leaving literal crap everywhere and also just destroying things for the sake of us learning about it, but ultimately just making a huge mess. Yeah, it makes me a little bit sad. That's why I kind of love national parks, like protect our nature because it's beautiful. Protect our planets. So, okay, we're going to call this one. You guys are more than welcome when the video goes up to leave any further questions in the comments. I can sift through and see if I can find things. I don't know if you tag me, it'll like color my name or the vintage space, I guess. But, you know, that might, I don't know. I'm trying to think. I don't know if that'll like make it stand out to me more because, yeah, inflatable spacecraft test. No, I want to find an inflatable spacecraft title. I will find this article that I wrote. If I wrote it, yeah. So when I used to write I wrote for a company that was taken over by another company, and when they switched everything over, they actually took away everyone's bylines, which is really frustrating as a writer, but also makes it hard to find. But I found it: NASA's original orbiting inflatable space station. We're going to answer this. It was called Advanced Man in Space, AMOS, the program at Langley, to help NASA study the psychological. Okay, great. Okay. So oh, sorry, I just see a good book question, right now, so we're gonna answer that, and then I promise I will do my actual sign off because 'cause it's been an hour and 43 minutes, and somehow 246 of you guys are still here, thank you. Ethan asked, I mentioned the Wrightsky brothers in a chapter of the book. That, that was in a letter between Jackie and, LBJ. Um I think it was Jackie writing to LBJ. She wanted to do something to help America regain preeminence in space, or to regain preeminence in terms of what it was doing technologically, and said, aviation's kind of the thing to point to. So we should do something to honor the Wright brothers, lest history start remembering them as the Wrightsky brothers. So that's coming from Jackie. That's not a name that I've seen anywhere before or since. That is a straight up Jackieism. Heliantrophy, thank you so much for that donation. I really appreciate it. Okay, so we're doing this. Like I said at the beginning, guys, this has been a part of my virtual book tour. Fighting for Space is the dual biography of Jackie Cochran and Gerry Cobb, two female pilots who both wanted to take control of a female astronaut program in the 1960s, even though one did not exist. It is available now everywhere. You can, there should be links in the description. You can buy it on Amazon. It's also available as an ebook as well as an audiobook read by me. And you can also buy it through any of your local bookstores. A lot of local bookstores are still shipping locally, or some might be even doing pickup. So if you do want to support your independent bookstores, that is a great way to do it. If you do want to know more about me, my blog all these links are, by the way, in the description. My blog, The Vintage Space, is on Medium. I'm posting roughly once a week. Usually what we're going to be talking about in the live stream this week. Like I said, I could not get the article to sound good. I just wasn't happy with it, so figured I'd just talk it out with you guys today. But we'll have more stuff going up later. A lot of you have been asking about more regular videos. They are coming. I was thinking I was maybe going to do a video per episode of the live book tour, but I think instead I'm actually going to take some of the bigger ideas and do the kind of Amy Soapbox thing where I'm speaking extemporaneously about it, but can edit it, can put images in, can kind of break away with some B-roll. So we're going to be seeing those coming, I think, June, July-ish. If you are new here, welcome. I hope you stumbled in and stuck around. Please do consider subscribing. We are doing one live stream a week for the next 2 months, and then we're going to be doing regular videos again. You guys can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'm Amy Share Title all around. There will be most updates are on Twitter. Both space stuff, book stuff, random stuff, a lot of cat stuff. The other Pete Conrad that's in my house. You can also find me. Polly asked if there's a way to get an autographed book. Unfortunately, there isn't. Because it's impossible to do it right now. The only way to get autographed books, unfortunately, is if you find me in person. I might try to figure out a way to do another round of signed book plates. If I do, I will announce that on Twitter. So follow me on Twitter for updates. I'm also on Cameo. If you or a friend needs a little space-based pick-me-up, you can actually book me on Cameo, which is a weird thing that I'm trying out, so you can find me there. The description also has a link tree. That's all of the links that I've already just said, as well as sign up for my newsletter. I'm just starting one. It is, I have not ever sent one out, but I will maybe be doing a monthly kind of roundup of the things I've been doing, so that if you aren't following me on social media, don't have a Twitter account, don't want to get one, you can still get some updates. So please do sign up if you are curious. I think that's everything. I think that's all the things. So yes, thank you guys again so much for sticking around for almost 2 hours today. I really do appreciate all of you guys hanging out. I hope this was entertaining. I hope it was educational. I hope it was fun. Leave any questions in the comments once this video is processed and up. You can also tweet at me. All the things. I think that's it. Book and I are going to say bye. Everyone, stay safe and healthy out there. Take care of yourselves and each other, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.